Welcome everybody. Was the opening session good?
We're good.
Okay, I missed it to do some final prep work, so it was good for you guys. My name is Sean McManus. I work for Post Consumer Brands, and I'm going to be presenting today AD109, Navigating the Jungle of Modern Web Development. Before we get started proper, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I've been an IT professional for over 19 years, most of that time in shops that are leveraged heavily with Notes and Domino. So I've done development, most of that time done administration, project management, BI work, kind of the whole gamut of life cycle development for projects. More recently, I've been a minor contributor to Notes and 9 and OpenNTF, and you can see a little bit more about myself and some of my side projects on my website there, spmcmanus.net. On a more personal level, I live in the Twin Cities. I like to complain about the weather in the winter. Some of you guys know. I love golf, baseball, craft beer, and my kids' sports, and not necessarily in that order. I figure in the last year, I've gone to over 150 of my kids' sporting events, baseball, basketball, and soccer. So when I'm not sitting in front of my computer, chances are I'm doing something involving their activities. And at the bottom of the screen, you'll see on some of my slides, I'll have related sessions to the topic at hand. So looks like Rob Novak also has an interest in beer.
I think you lost your desk chair.
You know what? No, go ahead. Go ahead. I can make do.
Who's gonna laugh? I can use it. Who's gonna laugh? I can borrow. 2 seats up here.
You could stand there and hit the forward button for me if you want.
That's work.
Sit in the chair.
Although you took the spot.
Look at you. You have purpose.
Give me a signal, you just hit that area. Yeah. I do a few demos, but
Are you ready?
yeah. So, why am I doing this topic? Well,
Nothing else to do.
yeah, well, there's nothing else to do, and modern web development is becoming increasingly more complicated. Not necessarily with the code itself, because a lot of the new tools and techniques we have out there abstract some of that and make our coding easier, but there's so much out there to learn about that oftentimes the challenge is knowing, well, what do I need to learn? Where do all these little pieces fit into the big picture? More and more there are different ways to modernize Notes legacy applications. So it used to be we would just, all right, we're just going to take this client application and we'll just put it on the web. And then it was xPages. But now you're starting to see all kinds of other methods for taking that Notes and Domino data, sending it up to the browser, but not actually creating that application in Domino Designer. So using things like Angular and other JavaScript libraries. So you have to kind of know what is this universe and what are we hoping to achieve there and what can we learn about all the different techniques that are out there and available to us. Keeping up is tough. Developers can face lack of time. You're focused on support. You're focused on projects that are critical to the company right now, but not necessarily in the bigger picture. And sometimes IT leadership lacks the focus to know where are we going in 5 years. So it helps you as developers and as IT decision managers out there to know what's out there, what can we do, and be able to know where these pieces fit into the big picture. So it's a little bit blurry on the screen, but you see here, this is the first website out there. You can still go to this using that URL. The late 1991, right about the time my favorite baseball team won their last World Series. And websites of that day were text. They were just simple text and hyperlinks that linked to other text pages.
That was the first one. What did they link to?
First website. That site had But if you look at the code behind the scenes, that's just HTML. So as developers back then, you didn't need to know a lot. You needed to know HTML, and that was basically it. Fast forward to today, and look at the variety of use cases we have for the web every single day. This is just a snapshot of them. You're on there, you're shopping, socially connecting with friends and family, reading news, entertainment, sports, planning a trip, social or business marketing, and event planning. So you combine all that with these statistics. In the last 20 years, growth of web users has gone from 16 million to over 3 billion, and websites from 23,500 to almost 1 billion websites out there. So you combine those things, and what you're going to see is a corresponding increase in tech. So chances are, if you look at that word cloud right there, you're going to find something in there that you don't know what it is or what it's doing. Or if you're like me, a lot of things in there that you don't know what they're. So my job today is to go ahead and to put some structure on this, to take this word cloud here and break it down, organize it, categorize it, and make it something that makes more sense to you guys. So in addition to that, I'm going to give you a basic explanation of some hot topics in the area. And then at the end, I'll show you a mind map where I took that word cloud and structured it and organized it in a fashion that makes a little bit more sense. This is not a technical deep dive. I'm not going to show very much code in there. It's not going to be very deep on any one particular topic. You're probably going to look at that and say, oh, I wish he would have talked about that more. But that's really the point. I'm going to give you some very broad information, and then you can go see the other sessions in the next 2 days that dig into deeper in those areas. No code demos. I've got a few little things I'm going to show, but it's really nothing to get too excited about. And it's not a complete overview. As I did some prep work for this, I found that every time I looked for information on one particular area, I found 15 other things that were related to that area that I didn't know about. And putting all of that into this session would have required me to be speaking for several days straight. So obviously with an hour, I'm just giving you the basics. Good. So if you look at the basic structure of web applications today, most of them look somewhat like this. You start at the bottom with the data storage layer. You have your application layer in the middle, and at the top, the presentation layer. In between those, you have data binding that connects the back-end data source to your application, and then obviously you've got the web server that takes that compiled application and sends it out to the browser. So the basic layout of that would be, if you're using an xPages application, you've got your Domino NSF, you've got your xPages, and then maybe you're connecting to the Domino NSF using a REST service or one of the proprietary data bindings in xPages. And then those xPages get compiled, they get sent out through the HTTP server and viewed in a browser like Chrome. So, more details on the data storage layer. Most data storage applications or databases, go ahead, are broken up into 2 major formats. So you've got your relational database model. Most of us know that as SQL. And then you have the non-SQL or no SQL databases, which are really anything else, anything that's not set up with tabular relations. So most of us are familiar with the document model. That's what Domino is built on. But there are other NoSQL types of databases out there too, column, graph, key value, and so forth. I think Nathan Freeman has a session on graph. And if you look at the related sessions on the bottom, there's several here that deal with backend stores that aren't specifically Domino. Go ahead. So if you're not familiar with the difference between relational and non-relational, you can kind of look at it in this basic example. Think of this diagram here on the left as a JSON representation of a notes document. So the JSON object there has attribute value pairs. Think of the left-hand column as the fields, and the right-hand column is obviously the data. Single and contained, but you have certain pieces of that data that are duplicated. They're stored on every single document. Whereas in a relational database model, you have that information, in this example, broken up into 2 tables. So you've got a user table and an address table. The user table contains some of that basic user information, and then it's keyed to the address table using, kind of an arbitrary zip ID that connects the 2. So the benefits of that is you don't have that data duplicated. If the city of, I assume that's supposed to be Mountain View, California, the city changes its name, you change it in that record, it updates everywhere else. Whereas, most of you are familiar with in the Domino world, things change. Sometimes you got to run an agent, you got to update everything on this side. It's kind of a pain. Excellent. So comparing the 2, SQL is very good with data integrity, as we discussed the uniqueness aspect of the data, and also at this point, SQL databases have superior query options and business intelligence tools. So a lot of time, that's why the business, or that's why the IT decision makers want your data in an SQL database because they can combine multiple areas and use the tools out there to come up with very sophisticated reporting. No SQL, on the other hand, data is not normalized, but you can sometimes see performance gains because you don't have that data stored in a single place. So if you've got a lot of users and they're all trying to access different records that have that mountain view information on there, they're not going to that single memory address to see that. NoSQL databases can be more scalable, although not really domino when you start talking about millions of records, but they're certainly more flexible. Go ahead. So these are the big players in the SQL market. They're dominated by the big guys: Oracle, IBM, and Microsoft. Postgres is another SQL database. NoSQL, Domino obviously, and then there's some open source options out there, Couch, Mongo, as well as Foundations. And there's plenty others out there too. These are just some of the biggies. So now moving on to the application layer. I think of the application layer as really the framework for writing your application. So this is where you do the work. This is where the business logic is. This is where you kind of put all of your code together. So in the Domino world, you can think of that as being your xPage, or you're working in Domino Designer, creating the xPage. It's all contained right there. It's essentially the pass-through between the data at the bottom and the presentation at the top. And application frameworks can be categorized in a bunch of different ways. One useful way to look at it is based on the base language. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see you've got Java, JavaScript, .NET, Python, and so forth, all the way down, and different application frameworks that are based on each of those languages. In this session, I'm not going to go through in detail every single one of them. I'm going to highlight some of the JavaScript frameworks because those are relevant for us now as Domino developers. Obviously, a few slides on xPages and how Bluemix fits into that as well. So, Express.js and Node.js, those are two JavaScript frameworks out there. They're often used together. Node is kind of the bottom level layer of that stack. It deals with all the server-side execution. Node is great for I/O, heavy I/O applications such as chat, stock tickers. Not so great with high CPU-intensive operations. Express is an application framework that kind of goes on top of that, allows you to build the UI, and it also abstracts away some of the more difficult features of Node. And I know this is really faint on here, but see Matt White's session later today for more information on Node. Other popular JavaScript frameworks this year: Angular, Backbone, and Ember. You can see all kinds of details on those. Those are becoming more and more used. They have different types of architecture to them. Backbone's an MVP, Angular is an MVC. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Go ahead. And then if you put some of those together, you'll hear of something called the mean stack. So probably the first time you heard that, you're like, what the heck is that? It's such a strange term to be calling something in our world. But it's essentially an acronym that stands for the four components: Mongo, DB, and then the three JavaScript frameworks: Express, Angular, and Node. And the benefit of using the mean stack is you have one single stack built with open source components, and they're all based on one single language, JavaScript. So the benefit to that is when you're exchanging data between certain parts of the application, you can use JSON, and the frameworks natively recognize the JSON format, and they're able to parse that and move it around much more easily than if you had other formats where you had to convert data back and forth between different types of areas. So go ahead to the next session. So I mentioned Model View Controller. This is becoming the recommended design pattern for web applications today. And the benefit to MVC is you get a clear separation of your application logic and your presentation. So if you look at this diagram right here, you can think of it as you've got your model, which is the data and the business logic, the view, which is how that's presented to the user. And in this context, we're not talking about a notes view. We're talking about anything that's displayed on the screen, any representation of that data. And then I like to think of the controller as sort of the dispatcher. The controller is taking requests from the user, inputs from buttons they're clicking or different things that they're doing, going back to the model, updating data, making some changes, and then maybe sending that back to the view. But the benefit of this is you have that structured you have your code structured in those 3 areas such that it makes it much more easy to maintain. So somebody wants to add something to the front end, you can make that change to the view without having to necessarily change a lot with the model side of the controller. So go see Ulrich's session on Friday. He'll give you a whole lot more on MVC and why that's an important thing to learn today. If you're looking at an xPages application, we mentioned that a little bit briefly earlier, but essentially you have your NSF data source, and then you as a developer, you're writing things in Domino Designer, creating xPages. Those xPages are then compiled by the XSP Java runtime engine, which itself is sitting on top of JSF 1.1. That's Java server faces, so built on Java. And then those are compiled and served up to the web browser using Domino HTTP server task. So Bluemix, I kind of struggled where to put this in this presentation because maybe it's not quite an application layer, but it really fits best in this section anyway. As defined here, Bluemix is an open standard, cloud-based platform for building, managing, and running applications of all types. So the big takeaway on this is IBM has this service out there, and you can take your applications written in a myriad of different languages and run them, host them on their site. And then you don't have to worry about the underlying hardware or networking components. So xPages is now available on Bluemix for experimentation only. I'm not sure about the timeline on that, but you can check out Mark and Ryan's session later today. They'll give you more details, not just about the xPages use of Bluemix, but also of all the other things that you can do using that platform as a service. Other competitors to Bluemix would include Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google App Engine, and Salesforce. So when you hear those names mentioned, you can think of those as kind of the same way that you're thinking of Bluemix in terms of what they're doing. Okay, now we're on the presentation layer. So I think of that as like how the stuff we code is presented to the end user. So most of the applications we create today are being consumed in a web browser on some device or another. Maybe it's a smartphone or a tablet or a PC, laptop, and so forth. And each of those browsers have their own set of components built into them that make all this stuff work right. So you've got your markup, your styling, JavaScript, and then some security parameters built into all the modern web browsers. So if you look at just some brief usage statistics, and this is really faint too, Chrome's leading the way in the mobile tablet market, followed by Safari and Android. But if you look at this, you can see there's 5 separate browsers that are getting over 10% of the market share in the mobile world. Go ahead to the next slide. So in the desktop world, you've got three main users that are still getting large percentage of the market. So the takeaway from those 2 slides is, as a developer, you have to know your audience. You have to know, are they going to be using whatever browser they want, or is this an internal application where I can control that? Because as you'll see, when you're getting into this stuff, that there are skeletons buried in the closet of some of these browsers, and things that work in one do not work in the other. So, yeah. So you have to know how to handle that. Next slide. So HTML, obviously, it's still the basic building block for all the web pages we build. Anything we do, even if we're not directly writing HTML, it eventually renders down to that level and is used in the browser. So right-click, view source, you're going to see HTML no matter what web page you're looking at. First created by Tim Berners-Lee in 1991. Blah, blah, blah. Go ahead to the next slide. HTML5.
Glad you spent the time on that slide.
When I practiced this session, I got close to an hour each and every time. So I'm going to speed it up a few times just to make sure I get done in time. HTML5 released, the official spec was released last year, but the interesting piece of HTML5 is not everything that's considered HTML5 is listed in the official WC3 specification. So as a result, there isn't any browser out there now that supports everything that we consider HTML5. So you can use this test link to see Chrome right now comes the closest. the biggest takeaway from HTML5 in my mind is, in addition to some of the other elements and attributes that make modern web development more easy with HTML5, you don't need Flash to support embedded video. So that's really a huge thing, because that's been a pain point for quite some time. The DOM, you can't know about web development without understanding what the DOM is. That's essentially a programming interface that takes the HTML on a page and renders it out there to a structured tree representation of the page, and allows for the server or the client-side scripting to be able to interact. So it's easiest if you go to the next slide. I'll show you a screen grab. So this looks exactly like HTML, or nearly like HTML. And what that is the browser taking the HTML and breaking it down into each element. Each element has its own node, and it's nested in a nice parent-child relationship. So what that does is that allows your JavaScript and all the subsequent JavaScript libraries to be able to grab those specific elements and do things with them. CSS, so in the beginning, we just had HTML, and in order to do things that are interesting on the page style-wise, you had to embed style attributes into your tags, and that was a nightmare to maintain, a nightmare to change, and it was a nightmare to read. So with the advent soon after of CSS, you could separate the presentation from the content, and a nice example here is this div class. It has a class attribute. 2 paragraphs have ID attributes, and then if you break that down, you've got the CSS on the other side. The dot selector indicates class. The pound selector indicates ID. Apply your style to it, and away you go. So that advent made it a lot easier for us to create nice structured content and maintain it going forward as well. So here's some details about the history of the CSS versions. It's not terribly interesting. Key takeaway on this slide is that some browsers parse the CSS code differently, i.e. So you have to understand what you're doing there, and in some cases have separate style sheets or have separate selectors inside your code to be able to handle that discrepancy. So I do have a quick demonstration there. No, that's good.
Just sit in his lap.
No, we're good. So if you look at the MWLUG homepage, you can, and this is true with most browsers today, you can right-click on just about any place on there, inspect the element. And then what you're going to see here on the left, this is a representation of the DOM. In this case, you've got a div with a class of hotel header. And on the right-hand side, when you select that, you see the CSS applied to that class. So if you want, when you're doing your testing, your development, you get in here and you can play around with this stuff. You can take off the font size, see what that looks like. You can add coloring, and then when you play around with that, you get what you want. You can copy out that CSS and then put it back in your style sheet. So just a little example of what the DOM does and how you can use that for doing some brief testing. Figure out how to do this. Shift F5. Shift F5 or Control F5?
Shift.
It's not doing it. Just hit yes. Oh, it's not going to go back to the beginning, is it? All right, perfect. So, built on top of CSS, you have these things called preprocessors. So, less and Sass are the most popular ones when you hear those names. Those are essentially extension languages that take the CSS language and add in there different things that you're used to in other programming languages. So you can have variables, math functions, operation functions. You can do a whole lot more with the preprocessors. And those then compile down into CSS. So a brief example of that would be, you've got this CSS, you've got a header element, and you're setting the font directly. But instead, you could set that font information to a variable, use the variable down there, and then obviously if you're using this particular element or that type of font elsewhere, you only have to set it once. So that's nice and handy too. CSS frameworks. Frameworks are huge today. They do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. They let you get started with an application and a UI that looks nice. It's something people are familiar with, and yet it gives you all of those components that let you not have to go to your art department or things like that to to get a nice UI look. Obviously, you may want to modify that in some cases, but it's a really good starting point. Typical CSS frameworks give you responsive design, they give you a grid structure, different sets of typography and icons, and all kinds of GUI components that you're used to seeing on modern websites. So two of the more popular CSS frameworks going on right today are Twitter Bootstrap and Foundation. And I'm going to give you just a quick demo on Twitter Bootstrap since that's the one I'm most familiar with of those two. So Twitter Bootstrap, you go to getbootstrap.com. You can download it. It's not very complicated to install. It's just a CSS and JavaScript files. And you can go to the components page on the Bootstrap website to see all about the different things that you can use. I don't like doing this demo using this page because I have to jump around too much. But if you go to bootswatch.com, which is an extension of Bootstrap, you can see much more easily, without having to click around, what the basic components are that are included with Bootstrap. So you get buttons, here's the typography, tabling, forms, different types of input indicators, different kinds of tabs, and pagination, and all kinds of great stuff that you're used to seeing in modern websites. Bootswatch is really cool though, because if you like kind of how this looks, but maybe you don't like that color scheme or you don't like those fonts, there's about 15 other themes out there that you can use that basically take that Bootstrap theme and change it a little bit. So let's see if I find one that's really different. Darkly. So another really easy way to get started. In addition to that, they're beyond Bootswatch. There's Wrap Bootstrap, which have pay themes available that are all built on top of Bootstrap and that allow you to do all kinds of sophisticated things. So you can see here, responsive admin theme, different types of templates, graphs, all kinds of stuff. So you don't have to do all this work yourself. You can rely on what other people have done, which is what we as developers love doing. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. Yep. So there's all kinds of stuff out there to help you along that way when you start using Twitter Bootstrap. Come on. There we go. So so every modern browser out there today supports JavaScript. JavaScript was first available in Netscape Navigator 2.0. And it's really the foundation for much of the client-side innovation that you see in modern web design. It really allows the client-side scripts to interact with the user, so you can do all kinds of great things on the front end without having to reload your page and all kinds of great things like that. So also, there are server-side implementations of JavaScript. We're all familiar with SSJS in the xPages world. Common uses for JavaScript, all kinds of stuff. Input validation, animation, event handling, DOM manipulation, input field enhancements, stuff that I don't have on this slide. You can do a lot of things with JavaScript. You can do all this stuff with base JavaScript, but I wouldn't recommend it. External libraries make a lot of this easier. Again, there are people that have written things that make your life a lot easier. Use those libraries. Which brings me to this. What's the difference between a library, a toolkit, and a framework? You hear that mentioned all over the place. And what's the difference? Well, turns out there isn't a definitive definition on those three terms. As much as I tried to find, there's not really a good consensus out there. Most people kind of think that a library is really a set of functions called to perform a specific task. jQuery is considered a library. On the other hand, Dojo is considered a toolkit. Not sure why. Toolkits maybe are integrated libraries. They have a larger set of tools. In the case of Dojo, it tends to require a little bit more effort to learn. I won't get too much into the Dojo jQuery debate here. Frameworks tend to be more end-to-end solutions. So we talked about Angular and Backbone earlier. There are others out there, EXTJS, Prototype. And what they do is they really control the whole coordination and sequencing of activities, kind of an end-to-end type solution. jQuery, most widely used JavaScript library, cross-platform, so it does work in other browsers without having to do too much gymnastics to make things work. And the key here, jQuery shrinks your lines of code. So you can do some great things in jQuery with very minimal code. And there's a whole infrastructure of things that are built on top of the base jQuery. jQuery itself has a UI, mobile, or plugins out there. Things we already discussed, like Twitter Bootstrap, require jQuery as well. So here's another brief demo here on one of the things you can do with jQuery. So I've got a very basic fiddle here set up. I've got a div, has an outer class, and then I've got 3 inner divs that are set by IDs. So if you look at the JavaScript code here, the jQuery code, button 1 isn't doing anything more than grabbing the element with an ID of div1 and hiding it. So one line of code, and I took that piece of the DOM and I got rid of it. Not really got rid of it, but I hid it from the users, from the front end. Button 2, taking the div with an ID of div2, the element with an ID of div2, finding the parent, and then appending some more code in there. Very simple. And third button, it's grabbing the element with a class of outer, and it's just toggling it closed. So I can go open and close. So very simple, basic animation. Yeah. Not complicated at all to do, but you can create really nice effects very easily on your pages, on your sites with that. Here's another thing about Dojo. I'm not going to read through all that. Dojo is installed natively on the Domino server, so some people like that. You don't have to install jQuery or use a CDN or anything. It's often compared to jQuery. Dojo has some people that really love it, some people that absolutely hate it. I tend to fall more on the jQuery side, but I'm sure it does have its use cases. And then you also have specific use libraries in JavaScript. So these are examples of things out there that people have created that are used to solve a specific problem. So dynatable.js gives you some really nice looking interactive tables. jQuery boot grid, there's a whole host more of those. Chances are, if there's something you're trying to do, some kind of interface you're trying to build, Google it. Google JavaScript library and then whatever you're looking for, and you're going to find a whole bunch of stuff out there. Some of it's crap. Let's face it.
Stop looking at Dave.
Let's face it. There are a lot of JavaScript libraries out there that aren't very useful, or they're old or they're not maintained. You have to kind of sift through that. But if you look hard enough, you're probably going to find something that's going to be very helpful for you. Ajax. So Ajax isn't strictly JavaScript, but JavaScript is used in Ajax type applications. Ajax stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, although increasingly more today, we're not using XML with JavaScript, we're using JSON. So it kind of brings together HTML, CSS, the DOM, and JavaScript. And the real takeaway point of Ajax is you get to exchange data back and forth between the server without reloading the page. So that's a huge win. Some examples are Google Maps, Google Suggests. So you're on your Google map, you're kind of going to the east a little bit, and you see, oh, more and more parts of that map load every time you scroll. So that's all kind of happening in the background. There are other languages out there that compile into JavaScript, CoffeeScript, GorillaScript, and so forth. So if you hear those names mentioned, they're really just derivatives of JavaScript. And there's also some server-side implementations too. Node is listed here because it kind of deals with the server-side aspects. IBM xPages, Ringo, and so forth. Security. I don't have a lot here about security, but there are 3 terms here that you're going to need to at least be aware of when you're doing development. You've probably heard of CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, and it's really the browser's way of determining, is it safe to take this request that's out of my domain and use it. So obviously there are some security reasons. If we just allowed everything open, we could have a lot of problems there with hackers and things like that. HTTPS, that's just encrypting your communication over SSL. And then OAuth, you're seeing this a lot today. Log in using your Facebook account, log in using Google. So that's that open standard that does the website authorization for you. and makes you not have to rewrite all of that. I'm not sure how many business applications are using this now, but when you hear OAuth, that's what it means. Data binding. So this is how you move the data from your back end to your application layer and then on to the presentation layer. In xPages world, it can be platform specific, so you're taking your xPage, you're binding it to a Notes view, a Notes form, or you can do what I call platform independent binding using a combination of these technologies here, JSON, XML, REST, and SOAP. And the interesting thing about these four here is they're not apples to apples comparisons. They're all kind of a little bit different piece of the pie here. So comparing SOAP to REST isn't necessarily a direct comparison. XML, extensible markup language, it was kind of the first one out there. Ideal for highly structured information, and then you need kind of a schema to go along with it so you understand the structure. Right there, if you look at that, that's kind of hard to read. Where is the data and where are the tags? So that's one of the downsides of XML. JSON, on the other hand, based on JavaScript, can be used as an alternative to XML. We saw that earlier in the SQL, no SQL slide. JSON's great because it's supported in all the basic JavaScript frameworks. And you can do all kinds of complicated things with the format of your JSON. So next screen, look at here. Here's a JSON object. Here's the attribute value pairs. This particular attribute itself has another object of attribute value pairs. This one down here has an array of attribute value pairs. So you can do all kinds of complicated things with the nesting depending on what the structure of the data is that you're working with. So brief comparison, JSON to XML. JSON's more efficient. XML's verbose. No formatting for the JSON. XML, you can do a little bit more formatting. JSON's easier to read and is readable by the JavaScript framework, so that tends to be one of them a bit more popular now. But XML has its beneficial use cases too. It's better for document sharing and extensible for other data types. So REST. REST is representational state transfer. It's an architectural style. It's not a defined protocol. It uses HTTP and all of the get, post, put, delete methods. And it's stateless. So I send something back using a REST service. The server doesn't know anything about that, doesn't maintain any of that information between requests. And so you'll hear this term used a lot, RESTful. A RESTful application or platform or service is RESTful if it conforms to all the REST architectural properties, of which there's like 7 or 8. It was a little bit too much detail to go into for this slide. But that's sort of, you have a RESTful situation, a RESTful service if it follows all the properties of this particular style. If you go to the next slide, SOAP's a little bit different. It's a defined protocol. There's all kinds of support out there for SOAP. SOAP protocols, services can be RESTful, so they're not mutually exclusive there. A SOAP service could follow some of the exact same properties as REST interfaces. But SOAP uses XML, so you have with it some of the baggage that XML contains. Web server. So only one slide on web server stuff here. These are some of the examples of basic web servers. This is how you get your data out to the web browser. Eric's got a session on Friday right here using Nginx.
Sean's going to come push buttons for
Yeah.
Works for me.
If you're interested in that, I didn't deal a whole lot with the web server level, other than you know that you need to have one out there. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to have anyone look at your fancy application. A few more things. Code repositories. You'll hear things like GitHub, Bitbucket, OSDN, Mercurial. These are online services that allow for source code hosting. They allow for code repositories. You can do revision control. And so when you hear of those terms, that's what we're talking about there, a way to put your code out there and manage it. CDNs, on the other hand, content delivery networks. This allows you to path out resources that you don't want to store on your web server. So jQuery, for example, Bootstrap, you can, instead of having a path to your local web server, you put in a certain URL, and it pulls it in that way. So more and more today, web applications are not in a siloed environment. So if you're using your web application, even in an internal network, as long as you can get out to the web, you can pull those in. So, yeah, that's going to be no good. So now we get to see the good stuff here. Yeah, the good stuff here. So you put all that together, and what you're going to see here. Let me see if I can make that even bigger. Let's see here. Here's all those terms we talked about earlier at in that word cloud, and break it all down. We've got a nice little map that kind of shows you all of these particular components, where they fit, and a few things in here that we didn't even talk about because I had to cut them out. So it's kind of a neat way, at least it was a neat way for me to kind of understand how I'm going to put together this application. And when I get back, I'm going to print this out and put it on my cube so I can just have that to refer to, make changes to it, mark it up. And I will have this available on my website, so even though you can't see all of it very nicely right now, it is pretty detailed. If I can.
Will you put your presentation on the website?
I will put my presentation on the website out there too. That'll be out there probably by the end of the weekend. Whoops. Back here. Yep. Cue the Jeopardy music. We're doing on time. Oh my gosh, we're early. Yep. So, in conclusion, modern web development is becoming increasingly more complicated, but all these tools out there allow you to transfer your skills more easily from one platform to the next. And complexity isn't necessarily occurring at the code level. It's occurring kind of above that, understanding what you need to learn and what you need to focus on. The code tends to make things easier. Each generation of tools kind of abstracts layers of complexity below that. And obviously, having a broad knowledge of this stuff, knowing where all these pieces fit, can only help you if you're a developer or if you're a decision maker in your IT organization. It can help you move forward, learn where the training is, learn how you can plan your infrastructure going forward to be most beneficial and to take advantage of all the new stuff that's coming out. So you're probably not going to be able to read this. Related sessions. Obviously, since this is a really big overview, broad session, pretty much everything in the app dev track out there. So go to everything. So here's my contact information. You can follow me on Twitter. When I get this stuff posted on my website this weekend, I will send out a tweet. So if you're following me on Twitter, you can get that. See my Gmail account, website. I'm on Skype now. The resources I use to put together this presentation, I have listed on my website at this link. You just need to filter on the tag NWLog AD109, and you can see a list of resources I use to kind of put together all this information. So, I'd like to share with you that at the end of the month, I will be starting with the talented team at PSC. So. Excited for that opportunity. It's going to be fun to get back into the world of consulting. I've been out of it for about 13 years, so I'm looking forward to getting back in there and working on some cool projects. And that's all I have. Any questions? Yes?
From this session and even this conference and going back to Connect, I wonder if Domino and xPages is going in the future, in the very near future, is simply going to be a legacy container for data and a directory.
Yeah.
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 Well, that's, I mean, is that your question? What?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
that's certainly a possibility. Obviously, I think Pete's got a session later. He's going to talk about the future of development, in Domino, so it'll be interesting to see what he says. Obviously, there are going to be companies that go to that. They have their entire universe, 15, 20 years of legacy data there. It's not necessarily going to be efficient to take all that data and move it into some other platform. So they may be looking for ways to get out of using Domino and being able to surface that data in other ways.
Well, follow-up
It's,
question.
it's also true that xPage development, it's harder to find xPage developers out there. So that's sort of one of the things that maybe is pushing people away from that.
A follow-up question. So we're trying to think of what we should do now to build, as we're building applications, to future-proof or to go in the right direction. Things like, we think now we want to use REST services for almost anything.
Yep.
So that you can separate that, and that's in that data
Yep.
binding layer. And put no logic
Right.
within the forms or
Yep.
the next pages and stuff like that. Any other things that we should kind of be thinking about as we go forward? We're thinking about using Angular and Bootstrap.
Yeah,
Instead of-
and that's sort of the key, you know, there's sort of two sides of this. As a developer, you want to be using those tools that make yourself marketable.
Right.
I mean, you may not be looking to leave your company, but you can't control what they're doing, and there's mergers and acquisitions, and change the CIO, and they want to go in a completely different direction, and so, you know, you got to take control of your own career. So using things like Angular are great because who cares if it's Domino data or if it's some other platform, you can still use those skills. So
And it's also good for the company because if they decide to get rid of Domino, we
absolutely.
set
Yep, yep. So I really support the move to what I call platform agnostic, you know, tools. I think that's great. I think that's where the modern web is going, and certainly, you know, a very positive thing for developers to be learning.
And it also just makes your life easier because there's more resources. There's more people
Absolutely.
doing those things.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
find good
Yeah, I mean, Kathy's right.
results.
We've got a great Domino community here, but it's only so big.
Yeah.
And I find that AJAX and JSON are great for just accessing back end data. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one
index-
kind of limitation you have with some of that stuff is, you know, Notes is so great with, like, you've got your rich text field that has all kinds
Sure.
of crap in it. You've got embedded pictures, you've got formatting, bullet points, links, attachments. That's where you sort of like run into some difficulty when you're trying to
You can
do
choose your
rich
battles.
service. Yeah,
There's maps you can do,
Yeah.
get away with that stuff, some maps you can't.
but yeah, it's,
So I've got a good solution.
go ahead.
Just back on the modern web, in addition,
Yeah.
there's a whole other dimension to this in terms of other content management systems. WordPress, Drupal, Joomla.
Yeah.
Are you familiar, or, I mean, I just comment on those as terms of the
Yeah,
usage space and...
I struggled whether or not I should include that
Okay.
that layer in this application, and I didn't.
Yeah,
But it
because-
but there is definitely a place for that, you know, amongst all this stuff. I didn't do that because I really wasn't sure how much that stuff's being used in a business corporate environment today. Maybe down the road, who knows?
Can you just go back 2 slides? I missed your contact information.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Go
Thank
ahead,
you.
you can just leave that one right there. Yeah, I do have a blog out there. I haven't been actively blogging. I hope to resume that more now that I'm getting into some.
Oh, he will.
I'll give Mark will be on me.
It's not optional.
Yeah, but it'll be easier to do now that I'm getting into some more interesting work, and so it'll be kind of nice.
Where are you doing that again?
PSC.
Oh, right, okay.
PSC. So, yeah. Any other questions?
I was just going to comment on the point of, well, is Domino going to stay, or is
Yeah.
your data, do you need to continue developing Domino? What we've done, we have a construction management app, and it's a Notes app being built since 1987.
Wow.
That's when the company started, the CEO.
You have data going back that far?
Yeah,
Awesome.
and yeah, we're a 27 years old company. And what we've done, and it's a challenge, like everybody in the room, but what we've been doing in the past 2 years, we created this middle layer of a combination of REST services. It could be JSON functions that would spit out data in JSON format. You create that middle layer. What we found very efficient, for us at least, is if you create that middle layer, you can keep all your business logic and all of your data where it's at with Domino, which is great. But you could surface the data with these layers, with creating that layer, and that allows you, in my vision in the future, if you decide to move data away, which probably you wouldn't need to, if you create that layer, then that layer would help you not only just surface the data to the web, but actually migrating to whatever platform you select to choose to.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge, and we've been going through it for years.
Right, that's a great point.
Yeah.
The other thing to keep in mind is you have to craft your solutions based on your skill sets that you have in-house. So, that's the thing to kind of keep in mind as you're looking forward with your IT infrastructure. If you're going to go down a certain road, then you need to make sure you've got developers there to support that. Or you can contact consulting companies to do some of that work for you.
That didn't take long.
Yes?
Are you yourself doing a lot of xPages work, or are you kind of skipping xPages and using these frameworks?
I'm going to be continuing to do xPage work. My background, I've been doing xPages, but I've also dabbled in Oracle Apex. So I mentioned that, and almost nobody knows what that is, which is sort of interesting. But it's Oracle's rapid application development environment. So it's all based on PLSQL. But it was really my first light bulb to, oh, I'm developing in a completely different platform, but I'm still running a ton of JavaScript. I'm still using Twitter Bootstrap. And so that was sort of like the first light bulb, hey, I can use this stuff and across platforms, like this is great. So yeah, I'll see myself continuing to work in the xPages world, but 5 years from now, who knows? Anybody else?
Testify, brother.
Hey, thanks guys, you've been a great opportunity.